Y'all better be respectful because we're talking about FNAF books today. Specifically, we're going to try and decide definitively whether or not the books are part of the game's timeline. Because we're talking about Into the Pit, the game that came out recently that's directly based off of the first short story from Fazbear Frights, Into the Pit. But if you want to flame me after today's video, don't do it on Twitter. I'm not really on there anymore, especially after recent events. Feel free to flame me on Blue Sky though. My username's right here, just Brytoast. Also, go follow me if you're over there. It's way better than Twitter. And while we're on topic, this is a little late, but I make these in advance. I just want to be very clear after some recent events. This community will always be a welcoming space for the left, the LGBT, people of color, women, pretty much everyone that the far right hates. And my advice to my US audience that is in that category right now, remember to love yourself and those around you. The one thing they can't stand is us loving our authentic selves. And to quote Justin McElroy, I'm going to wake up and keep trying to do good, and no one gets to vote on that. Anyway, Five Nights at Freddy's. Slices, put on your aprons and let's bake ourselves a theory. So what is this whole FNAF book debate about? Well, there are currently 4 series of FNAF books out there. The Silver Eyes, Fazbear Frights, Tales from the Pizzaplex, and the new interactive novels. But if you release this many books based on your games, a question naturally presents itself. Are these books in-timeline stories that actually happen, or are they spin-off side stories that could take place in your universe but didn't actually happen? For Five Nights at Freddy's, this answer seems to change depending on what series of books we're talking about. Oh. It's like a whole cavern down here. Feels like it just keeps going. At least I'm in the shade now. And there's plenty of water. Boring though. There's sponsors though. Today's video is sponsored by Fume. I have a lot of bad habits that tend to stem from my fidgeting, cuticle biting being my most common one. Well, lucky for me, there's a way to replace that bad habit with a good one, and that's with Fume. And let's be super clear, Fume is not a vape. There's no batteries, no vapor, and nothing to charge. That's because Fume is a flavored air device that draws flavor to your mouth by breathing through their non-toxic cores. What really makes Fume special is how customizable it is. It's got delicious flavors like crisp mint and orange vanilla, so there's something for everyone. Plus, and this is my favorite part about it, this device was designed to fidget with. When you adjust the airflow, it makes a satisfying click. And it even has additional silicone toppers so you can chew the end of it, something I do all day. Fume continuously invests in third-party studies to ensure the safety of their product, and is backed by doctors in the US. This holiday season, you can give the gift of better habits with Fume. Head to tryfume.com/rytoast and use code RYTOAST to get a free Fume topper when you order a journey pack. It's the perfect addition to make your gift even more special. And if you're lucky, you could even win one of Fume's limited edition gold-plated devices this holiday season. Again, tryfume.com/rytoast or scan the QR code on screen to grab yours now and make someone's holiday unforgettable. Thanks again to Fume for sponsoring today's video. Well, now I can bring this with me at least. Deeper we go. The first series, the Silver Eyes novel trilogy, everyone pretty much definitively agrees cannot take place within the game's timeline. This is a separate alternate universe. After all, in these books, Henry Emily, the co-founder of Freddy's, creates a robotic replica of his daughter Charlotte Emily after William Afton kills her. This theoretically could happen in-game, but the issue presents itself when Henry takes his life soon after. Meanwhile, Henry Emily is alive up until FNAF 6 because he creates FNAF 6. Not to mention other inconsistencies, like the fact that in the games, William Afton dies in a springlock suit in a back room surrounded by ghosts. But in the books, that robotic Charlotte Emily triggers the springlock suit that William is wearing in front of a group of people. It's a completely different scenario. These events do not line up and are in fact contradictory enough that the books cannot take place within the game's timeline. But these stories are still useful for lore because of the universe they're set in. For example, William Afton experiments with Remnant, the material that's a combination of spirit and metal, and we learn a lot about it through his experiments. Even though these exact experiments didn't take place in the games, the fact that they take place in the same universe implies this is how Remnant works in the games. Just additional information for the lore finders. Nothing you need to understand the games, but nice touches. Moving on to the interactive novels, these books are similarly definitively one way or the other on this debate, but unlike the Silver Eyes, it's the opposite category. Now granted, only 2 books of this interactive novel series are out so far, but both of them, VIP and The Week Before, before seem to definitively take place within the game's timeline. All the lore that they've presented so far is not contradictory, and in fact can bridge some gaps between Tales from the Pizzaplex and the games, but the week before is so straight up FNAF 1 it's not even funny, to the point where the back of the book even directly states it is a prequel to FNAF 1, and it describes many locations and animatronics one for one. And probably the most important thing for this debate, all the lore that these books have presented are not contradictory. They're instead supplementary. They give us more information on things we already knew about, and help to flesh out a more colorful picture of the lore. I'm not kidding when I say the week before is possibly not only the most lore-packed book in the series, but the best one. If you have not read the week before, I cannot recommend it enough. The ambiguity of this debate begins to appear when we move on to the short stories collections, and we'll start with Tales from the Pizzaplex. If you haven't noticed it yet, I'm not like sick, but my allergies have been acting up fierce, and I'm sure you can hear it in my voice. Tales of the Pizzaplex are the series of short stories that came out just before the interactive novels, and all take place within the security breach era of FNAF. You know, they're Tales from the Pizzaplex, it's pretty self-explanatory. But the question on whether or not these stories take place within the game's timeline is actually a lot more mixed within the community. On the surface, all in all, I think I personally lean to these stories taking place within the game's continuity as of now. Many, if not most of the short stories are actually completely disconnected from the game timeline, and instead give us more information about this Pizzaplex and other associated Pizzaplexes. It helps to flesh out the world, not directly contradict anything. Meanwhile, all the game timeline relevant lore that the books do present don't seem to conflict with much because it's all focused around the Mimic, the antagonist from Security Breach Ruin, and possibly Security Breach, and possibly Help Wanted, and possibly Help Wanted 2, and possibly Special Delivery, and hell, possibly showing up in FNAF 2. It's a whole thing. But regardless, right now the games tell us barely anything about the Mimic. A lot of it is still yet to be revealed. So because of that, most of the information we get about the Mimic from the books is not inherently contradictory. So at least until Secret of the Mimic, I think it's safe to assume these books are in continuity. And who knows, maybe Secret of the Mimic will come out and tell us that Henry created the Mimic in the game's timeline, which will then X all of the Tales in the Pizzaplex books from the timeline. But until we get a confirmation either way from that, I think it's safe to assume that these books are in continuity. So now, the series of books I saved for last, and the main topic of today's video, Fazbear Frights. The series of books where I believe a majority of the book canonicity debate takes place. And look, I'm gonna mess this up, I know I will. Scott has stated before that all FNAF media is canon, but not all FNAF media is within the same continuity. I'm going to mix up those words. They mean different things. Canon means official, canonicity means in the same story. Give me a little bit of grace. This video is very long, the script is 4,000 words. I may accidentally say canon when I mean to say in continuity. That's what we're arguing today. Are the Fazbear Frights stories in continuity? So if I slip up and say canon, just know that that's what I mean. The short stories in these books swing wildly in a lot of directions. You can get anything from Fazbear branded sea monkeys that possibly end the world to a girl whose body is slowly replaced with garbage. Some of these stories, Freddy's is barely mentioned. In fact, I'd argue like half of the stories, Freddy's is maybe in the background. It's sort of a modern day Goosebumps with Freddy's as this looming dark miasma over the entire scenario, rather than an active presence, which I think is a really cool idea. But similar to Tales from the Pizzaplex, the epilogues are where the major story and lore implications come from, some of which is directly seen in the games in some way. So then the question becomes, are these books within the game's timeline? And I do want to be clear here before we get into the weeds of this debate, and that's to differentiate on theories about these books. Whenever Fazbear Frights is brought up in the theory space, there's typically three ways of thinking about the books that I've seen: FrightsGames, FrightsFiction, and StitchlineGames. FrightsGames is the theory that every single Fazbear Frights story and the epilogues take place within the game's timeline. I tend to disagree with this theory because, like I mentioned, again, just sea bonnies alone would have possibly ended the world, and that's not the only story that has world-ending implications. So I think it's safe to say that that theory is kind of bunk. There's FrightsFiction, which purports that these stories exist within the game's timeline as merchandise that Fazbear themselves sells. We know that Fazbear is trying to make light of the situation and make fun of itself, so it's not impossible, but I've yet to see compelling evidence for this theory. It's kind of just a posited hypothesis. And finally, StitchlineGames. This is the theory that purports just the epilogues and its associated stories are the things that appear in the game's timeline. This wraps up fairly neatly, because the epilogue does mention several stories of Fazbear Frights. Some of the main main characters of the epilogues have their start in a Fazbear Frights story. And coincidentally, all of the world-ending implication stories are not in this list. So if any of these are possible, I think StitchlineGames is the most likely. But the question is StitchlineGames true? And we'll get there, but just for the record, Stitchline comes from the word Stitchwraith timeline, because the Stitchwraith is basically the main character of the epilogues, so the timeline of the Stitchwraith being in the games, StitchlineGames. Well, for much of the history of FNAF, the fandom was pretty split on this decision, because these stories have a lot of strange details that on the surface feel weird to fit into a timeline, and the whole story is kind of wild. So many fans, if not most fans, just went, well, it's in the books, so who cares? It's probably not in continuity. After all, they're never referenced in games, so why should we bother? And like, that's a little dismissive, but it's not an unfair argument. But now we have a game called Into the Pit, and it's directly based off of the first Fazbear Frights story, Into the Pit, which is one of the associated stories of the Stitchwraith epilogues, if not one of the more important ones, because that ball pit is featured front and center, especially at the end of the epilogues. Not to mention, soon we'll have Return to the Pit, an interactive novel also based off of Into the Pit. And so far, the first two interactive novels were directly in the game's timeline. So now there's really no valid reason to outright dismiss StitchlineGames. So we'll have to use the old-fashioned way to figure out if this theory is true, actually theorize about it. The most logical way I can think of to solve this question is to compare what the Fazbear Frights story tells us about the game's timeline and what we know about that series of events from the games directly, and see if any of their lore contradicts. It's how we know that the Silver Eyes is not in continuity, because it goes directly against what the games tell us. So we'll do the same thing for Fazbear Frights, which means I finally got to do it. This is a slightly abridged, but mostly all-encompassing retelling of the Fazbear Frights epilogues and what associated stories get pulled in. Starting with one of the associated stories, The Man in Room 1280. Soon after the FNAF 6 fire, paramedics investigating the scene find the burnt, should-be-dead but somehow alive corpse of William Afton. The suit must have melted off him or something, because they just bring the body to the hospital. While at the hospital, the nurses try to put him out of his misery, but they can't even seem to kill him. They're supremely creeped out by his presence. Anytime they try to kill him, they say this small boy's spirit with an alligator mask and curly black hair prevent them. We learn later that this spirit is named Andrew. While they monitor the body, it also shows that there are two consciousnesses within William Afton's brain. Eventually, a priest gets through to the corpse, and the corpse asks for a Fazbear distribution warehouse. The priest brings him there, and once there, William Afton's body convulses and explodes into a black goop all over the surrounding technology. That black goop is made out of William Afton's agony, and it infects everything it landed on. In these stories, it's explained that agony is the energy created when humans feel the worst possible emotion, agony. It's further explained that when a supremely tragic event takes place, nearby objects can be infected with the agony of what happened. That energy can possess things and manifest in different ways if controlled with a consciousness. These objects that were infected make up the majority of the associated stories I was talking about earlier, where, for example, in one of the stories, a robot dog who is supposed to sync up to your phone and give you information begins going too far, violently retrieving every whim that this boy thinks of. That dog is doing that because William Afton's agony infected it. But not just William Afton infected these objects. Eventually, that dog, Fetch, is collected by Phineas Taggart, who's been studying the effects of agony and trying to utilize the energy. Much of what we know about agony comes from his studies. In an experiment, he takes the agony from several objects and, using a machine, filters them into an endoskeleton. And once sufficiently agonized, he takes the battery from that Fetch dog animatronic and places it in the chest of the endoskeleton. He then takes the mask of a creepy doll and puts it on the endoskeleton's head, trying to give it a sort of consciousness. This works, and it stands up and reaches out to touch Phineas. When it does, he instantly dies, shrivels up, and cries black blood. Sometime after, we actually get the point of view of this endoskeleton, and it's noted that two spirits are dwelling within it, one from the mask and one from the battery. The one from the mask, Jake, can control the endoskeleton and look around the environment. The one from the battery, Andrew cannot see or hear anything from the outside world or control the endoskeleton, but it's his agony that the boys assume is the reason why when they touch people they instantly die. It's never said definitively, but it's heavily implied a few times that it's actually William Afton's agony that's causing that, as both William and Andrew's consciousnesses were in the body that exploded. Jake resolves that they have to collect all of the other infected items and destroy them so no one else gets hurt. They do this for a while, and as they do, Jake learns that Andrew can't move on, likely until all of the objects are collected, as he himself is shattered among them. When it's fully completed, they try to use a trash compactor to destroy all of the objects, themselves included, and jump in. But it's in that moment that it's revealed all they've done is gather all of Afton's agony in one location, and his will begins to take over that pile of trash. It's in this moment that Andrew actually seems to move on, and Jake, still remaining in the endoskeleton, gets ejected from the pile. There's also a couple characters that have been doing stuff in the background that I'll introduce now. Detective Larson had been looking into the incidents going on in these short stories, and he ends up at this factory in this moment with a broken puppet mask. That broken puppet mask is reaching out to Larson, begging it to be thrown into the pile. There's also a robotic girl named Eleanor, who is definitely evil, but we have no definitive origin. We don't know where it came from, but it's also been trying to collect the pieces of Afton, and in this moment it joins the trash heap. There's a bit of a fight, but eventually Detective Larson is able to use a forklift to push the amalgamation into a nearby lake, while getting the puppet mask inside of it, and once done, the puppet's will begins to overtake the trash heap, and forces it to rip itself apart, dismantling it and sinking into the bottom of the lake. Eleanor manages to sneak off before it's destroyed. After the fight, Detective Larson is unconscious, and Jake realizes something much more nefarious than Afton was powering that thing, and it's still out there, so he sets out to find it. Eventually, he finds a homeless girl who calls herself Renelle, and she says that she's estranged from her father, asking for Jake's help, to which he obliges, and brings her to her father's home. They arrive at Dr. Talbert's house, a man who is studying Remnant, the combination of metal and spirit. It's in this moment as well that Detective Larson shows up, trying to follow up on some information about Remnant, and in that moment, Renelle reveals herself to actually be Eleanor in disguise, and another fight happens. But by the end of it, Jake is able to tackle and burn away at Eleanor's body, meanwhile going through her memories and throwing her consciousness into her most miserable one. She is gone and defeated, and a while later, Jake's barely functioning endoskeleton wanders to a ball pit in an abandoned pizzeria and falls in. Once he does, he begins to see the memories of several of the victims of the Fazbear Frights stories, and one by one, he reaches out to them, helps them to find peace and rest. Yeah, that's a crazy buck-wild story, but the main importance of it is that it involves taking William Afton's body out of the FNAF 6 location, exploding his body, and then destroying the technology that his body exploded onto. Like, it is the most definitive way to kill a guy ever. So all of the events of these books seem to take place after FNAF 6 Ultimate Custom Night and before Help Wanted Security Breach. It even explains what Ultimate Custom Night is. After all, Andrew was in William Afton's mind, and he says he hated him so much that he wanted to keep him alive to torment him, which feels like an Ultimate Custom Night thing. And you guessed it, the strongest connection to this story being involved in the games is Into the Pit, because that ball pit that he falls into at the end is the very same ball pit from Into the Pit. So if this is what the books are presenting, what do the games tell us happened between FNAF 6 Ultimate Custom Night and Help Wanted Security Breach? And are there any major contradictions? Well, the games tell us nothing. I've complained about this before, but from the perspective of a fan who is only playing currently available games, there's literally no explanation to what happens between FNAF 6 and Security Breach. For all you know, William Afton dies and is stuck in Ultimate Custom Night, and then suddenly, at the end of Security Breach, FNAF 6 is in the basement, and it's never explained why. On the surface, this all seems perfect. Like, okay, there's no issues. This whole story can slot right into this big gap in the plotline of the games, and we can just move on. It doesn't affect anything too drastically, you can still understand the games without it, but if you really want to know the nitty-gritty of the timeline, then you'll have to read the books. Well, not quite. There is one issue I see, and that's Andrew being the one who does Ultimate Custom Night. If StitchlineGames is true, then like I mentioned, Andrew would be the one creating and manipulating Ultimate Custom Night. After all, in the story, Andrew says that he was in William Afton's body trying to keep him alive to torture him because he hated him that much. And when they scanned his mind, they literally saw two consciousnesses. Frankly, Andrew being the one behind Ultimate Custom Night doesn't make a lot of sense with the information we have from the games. First of all, all, who is Andrew? Literally who? We nearly definitively know 4 of the names of the missing child incident victims, especially with the week before confirming Susie and Jeremy, comparing it to the FNAF 6 graves. And the security logbook, I believe, seems to imply that 5th victim was named Cassidy. Now, to be fair, Into the Pit does give us a possible way out here if Andrew is a missing child incident victim, and that is that it doubled down on there being 6 victims in the MCI. The book initially said this, but it said half a dozen, so a lot of people were like, is this a rounding situation? Is this an estimation? But then the game show us what seemed to be 6 silhouettes, and then in the hat minigame, there are the 5 hats you collect, and then you go out of bounds to collect a secret 6th hat, a 6th victim. But if that's true, is he Golden Freddy? This matters because Ultimate Custom Night seems to imply that Golden Freddy's spirit is the one creating Ultimate Custom Night. After all, the spirit creating Ultimate Custom Night several times mentions that we're gonna be here forever, you and me, I'm keeping you here, we're never moving on, forever and ever, it's just us. And then what is the final unlock that you can get at the very end of Ultimate Custom Night if you beat everything? It's Golden Freddy's suit twitching and fading into the distance, as if going on endlessly. To me, this seems pretty direct, and again, nothing here is confirmed, but to me it seems like this is pretty directly stating that Golden Freddy's spirit is the one keeping him here. So if that's true, would Andrew be in Golden Freddy? A lot of people, myself included, leaned on that being true. Especially in another story, The New Kid, someone looks into the old Fredbear suit and swears they see curly black hair, just like what is described Andrew as having. However, Into the Pit giveth, and Into the Pit taketh away. In Into the Pit, the game, there are several minigames that refer to other Fazbear Frights stories. 3 very important ones, to be fair. To Be Beautiful, which features Eleanor, Count the Ways, which features the first victim that Jake helps in the ball pit, and Fetch, the dog whose battery is put in the Stitch Wraith, which puts Andrew in the Stitch Wraith. So it can be assumed that much of Andrew's consciousness ended up in Fetch. Now, in case you've never read the Fazbear Frights story Fetch, you're in luck, because on Doze, my 3rd channel, actually just released an audiobook reading of the whole thing. So if you don't want to read it or don't have access to it and prefer audiobooks, you can listen to the full thing right there. But briefly, for the purposes of this video, a couple of kids break into an old Freddy's and find an animatronic dog, like I mentioned. It's supposed to sync up with your phone and give you the information you want. But because this dog is possessed, basically anytime our main character wants anything and verbalizes that through somebody, Fetch menacingly and violently gets it for him. Like, a dog attacks him on the way home, and he texts his friend, "That crazy dog almost got me." And the next morning, that dog's brutalized corpse is on his porch. Fetch got it for him. So if that's the story, what's the minigame? Because Count the Ways is abstract but fairly accurate to the story, and To Be Beautiful is abstract but fairly accurate to the story, while Fetch is completely different. In the Fetch minigame, we collect 6 balloons, present it to Fetch, presumably win Fetch, and then it immediately kills us. Doesn't happen in the story at all. In fact, our main character's life isn't in danger. He's trying to prevent other people from getting hurt. So the minigame isn't super accurate, but it's important regardless, because Fetch is in it and he kills someone, which implies that Fetch is possessed in this moment. And if Fetch is possessed, it's possessed by Andrew's consciousness to an extent. And if that's true, then Andrew is in this dog. And that's important because Golden Freddy is in the same minigame, and Golden Freddy's eyes light up when you walk away. They didn't need to put Golden Freddy in this minigame. They didn't need to make a Fetch minigame, but they made a minigame, Golden Freddy and Fetch being the only 2 animatronics in here, and they're both possessed at the same time. So either Andrew's consciousness is both in Fetch and Golden Freddy doing 2 completely separate things, which doesn't seem likely because Golden Freddy seemingly wasn't at the factory, and it definitely wasn't in the trash heap because someone would have mentioned that, or Andrew can't be in Golden Freddy, and likewise wouldn't be the one doing Ultimate Custom Night. Thus, bringing us back to the title of this video. Into the Pit, the game, provides us the best evidence and most conclusive evidence we've ever had that the Stitch Wraith stingers are within the game's timeline, and simultaneously gives us a damning piece of evidence to go against it. And because of that, it's still a toss-up on whether you think this theory is true, which is really important for the rest of the franchise. Honestly, you have to make an assumption either way. Either the Stitch Wraith stories are within the game's timeline, Andrew is doing Ultimate Custom Night, and this Golden Freddy cutscene has to mean something else, or the Stitch Wraith stingers are in the game's timeline, and Andrew is in Golden Freddy at the same time game as Fetch and is doing Ultimate Custom Night from Golden Freddy, or the Stitch Wraith Stingers are not in the game's timeline, and we have our first fully fleshed out game that is in its own separate timeline from the other games, which is a crazy precedent to set. And like I mentioned, this is a very important distinction to make, because if StitchlineGames is true, then that would mean that this corpse is not William Afton. William Afton's corpse is gone. This definitively cannot be William Afton if the Fazbear Frights epilogues are in the game's timeline. So this theory determines this 1-to-1. At the end of the day, no one has the answers for this. And Scott sure as hell won't tell us. Me personally, I still lean towards Golden Freddy being the spirit who is doing Ultimate Custom Night to William Afton. And because of that, I think that Golden Freddy's spirit is Cassidy, as the security logbook implies, which goes against StitchlineGames, which currently means I believe that the Into the Pit game is a separate series of games, like how the Silver Eyes is a separate series of books. But honestly, it's still kind of foggy, and any more definitive evidence in anywhere of this part of the timeline would be appreciated, and I'm sure my opinion will change a couple weeks from now. But what do you think? I would honestly love to hear your thoughts on this debate in the comments below, respectfully. If you want to be mean, you at least got to follow me on Blue Sky. Don't forget to go to tryfume.com/Rytoast and use code Rytoast to get a free silicone topper with your journey pack today. Thanks again to Fume for sponsoring today's video. Anyway, if you want another video to watch, last week on Rytoast, I made a video about which Pokemon might get a Mega Evolution in Legends ZA. And I also forgot Diancie gets a Mega Evolution, but don't worry about it. If you want your fan art featured on the channel, make sure to share with #ToastArt. Huge thank you to the best channel members, the Dough Risers. And until next time, as always, stay toasty, slices.